So good afternoon. The title of this presentation is Serial Killers in Alaska, Human Trafficking and MMIP, How Bob Hansen Got Away with Murder, 1971 to 1983. On this title slide, you'll see the cover of a book, Butcher Baker, and a cover of a movie, Frozen Ground, and a cover of another movie, The Butcher Baker Mind of a Monster. The learning objectives are a long-term overview of Alaska's serial killers, human trafficking, MMIP in Alaska, as well as the current status of serial killers after 1983, the challenges today for services for victims of crime, tips on crime prevention in Alaska, and then there'll be a summary opportunity for questions and comments. Viewer discretion is advised. The topics are serial killers in Alaska, human trafficking, missing Indigenous persons, murdered Indigenous persons, human trafficking. There are two broad categories of human trafficking: forced labor and commercial, coerced commercial sex. The topics may be upsetting for some. Viewer discretion is advised. People under age 18 need a parent or guardian permission to attend. Afterwards, if you need someone to talk to, find someone to talk to, or call 988. 988 works in Anchorage as well as many other communities, villages in Alaska. Counseling is a sign of strength. Through counseling, we can heal and get back in the battle. This training is sponsored by Aleutian Pribilof Islands Association, the Alaska Native Justice Center, the STOP grant, which is Standing Together for Our People. This training is also certified by the Alaska Police Standards Council. So if you happen to be a law enforcement officer in Alaska, make sure to let me know so I can get you a nice certificate from the Alaska Police Standards Council. A quick definition of serial killing: it's the killing of 3 or more people over a period of more than 30 days with a significant cooling off period between killings. This definition is from the United States Department of Justice, Office of Justice Programs. It's important to emphasize that Indigenous people have been living successfully in Alaska for at least 10,000 years, excellent parents and grandparents. Like an Alaska Peninsula brown bear, loving yet protective, will die to protect our children and our elders. For at least 10,000 years, Alaska Natives have taught youth how to survive and thrive, fighting skills and military skills to survive attacks by humans and animals, to travel in pairs of 2, at least 2, to be vigilant of our surroundings. Please take the pre-post survey. I put a link in the chat window that has a link to the pre-post survey. It's just a few questions. And if you fill that out, I'll get you a nice certificate of training. One little reason why you want this certificate of training is that it includes a contest. There's 2 veiled references in this certificate. And if you can figure them out, one of them is somewhat obvious, the other one is extremely subtle. If you can figure out these 2 veiled references, you'll be eligible to win a prize. Don't worry about writing everything down. I talk fast to cover the information. I'll post, someone put in the chat window, can I post the link again? If you scroll up, it should be up there. But if you can't find it by scrolling up, I'll put a link to the survey at the end of the presentation, or email me and I can get you a copy of I can get you a link to the pre-post survey. Again, don't worry about writing everything down. I'll reduce this PowerPoint to a PDF and I can email it to you if you send me an email. And this presentation will also be available on YouTube or a similar presentation. And an introduction to myself. I was raised on Cold Bay on the Alaska Peninsula, population 32. I attended Cold Bay Elementary School, 1st through 8th grade. My father, Bob, served the United States Army during World War II. My mother served as a civilian nurse. The Anna Livingston Memorial Medical Clinic in Cold Bay is named in honor of my mother. As a youngster, I was a bit naive about crime. I was trusting of strangers, and I thought all people were kind. I did not know about bad criminals or how cruel people can be when I was growing up in Cold Bay. At age 21, I joined the Unalaska Police Department. I pinned a badge to my left chest shirt, strapped a pistol to my right side of my belt and a police radio to the left side of my belt. I worked for the Unalaska Police Department for 3 years, the University of Alaska Campus Police for 2 years, the Anchorage Police Department for 20 years, I've also served with the Sandpoint Police, the St. Paul Police, and the King Cove Police. I've been evicted of attempted homicide 3 times. I've had friends and relatives who are MMIP. Currently, I serve with the Healthy Relationship team at Aleutian Pribilof Islands Association. I have a master's degree in psychology, a master's degree in anthropology, and a doctoral degree in education. I've also served as a principal investigator with the National Science Foundation. Some of the best training I've attended over the years is a class called Homicide and Sex Crimes, instructed by the Federal Bureau of Investigations in April 1983 by world-class instructors such as Special Agent Robert K. Ressler, Special Agent John Douglas. These agents focused on serial crimes. They did jailhouse interviews of serial killers from coast to coast. They really did their homework and became global experts on the topics of serial killers. Not only how to investigate them and solve them, but hopefully how to prevent them from occurring. I worked for the Anchorage Police Department from 1983 to 2003 as a patrol officer and detective. I served with several units, including robbery and sexual assault, crimes against children unit. I assisted in the investigation of cold case homicides and serial killings. Some of the serial killing cases involved hundreds of detectives from many agencies, well-coordinated teams. The serial killer being arrested in this picture, I checked recently in Vine. He's scheduled to be released February 16th, 2076. At that point in time, he'll be age 96 and will not be in a position to continue to do serial killings. I've researched serial killings in Alaska back to 1741, and I've noticed some recurring themes. One is a get-rich-quick scheme at any cost, and it began in Alaska with sea otter furs, and then northern fur seals, expanded to gold, natural resources, human trafficking, and then drugs such as opium, cocaine, pain pills, fentanyl. Other recurring themes are addictions to tobacco, alcohol, and drugs. The initial plan quite often is to kidnap, but tragically, too often that plan transitions into a homicide. It also includes themes of dehumanizing victims and blaming victims. In 1741, a Danish Captain Commander Vitus Bering sailed into Alaska. On board was George Wilhelm Steller, a German naturalist and doctor, and Swedish military Lieutenant Sven Waxel. Their ship was about 80 feet long. They had about 80 men on board, and they were heavily armed with pistols, rifles, cannons. They also brought with them alcohol, tobacco, and Chinese charlogs, which is opium. And they brought tobacco with them because the King of Russia, Peter the Great, said, "Take tobacco because the natives will be eager for tobacco." But the historical record indicates that is wrong. This triad often continues today with the alcohol, drugs, and firearms, but not always. Military Swedish Lieutenant Sven Waxel kept a journal, and it was published under the title of The Russian Expedition to Alaska. And in his journal, Lieutenant Sven Waxel records that the intentions of the 80 men on board the ship was to kill Alaska men and to kidnap Alaska Native women. They wanted to do this so badly that Captain Commander Vitus Bering had to give them written orders: do not kidnap and do not kill. Lieutenant Sven Waxel notes that his military men, would have just as well killed the savages. And savage is a code word for non-human beings, and you cannot murder a non-human. And these words are echoed in 1983 from the words of Bob Hansen, Alaska's most prolific serial killer: you cannot murder a person exploited in human trafficking. Fast forward to 1824, when Russian Orthodox priest Ivan Veniaminov moved to Alaska. He lived in Alaska from 1824 to 1834 and then moved to Sitka. And in his journal, he wrote that the goal of the early Russians, Promyshleniki, in the 1760s was to exterminate the Alaska Native people. The deeds of these first Russians towards the Aleuts were horrible. These men did not much value the life of an Aleut. In today's language, Alaska lives do not matter. It's important to note that all lives matter, and no one deserves to be a homicide victim, regardless of their life choices. In his journal, Father Ivan Veniaminov noted that 2 Russians, Glotov and Soloviev, went rather beyond the limits. They depopulated entire villages, entire islands, and entire island groups. They circumnavigated Unimak Island, the most heavily populated island in the Aleutian Islands, and where the people were most resistant to becoming slaves to the Europeans, and they went from village to village until the last person was killed. They also depopulated the islands of the Four Mountains and other island groups. Back in the 1760s, Europeans believed that Alaska natives were subhuman. And someone might say, Mike, that was 200 years ago. People don't believe that still today. But tragically, some people do still believe this today, especially if alcohol, drugs, or human trafficking are involved. Fast forward to the 1930s, when an American anthropologist named William Laughlin traveled to Umnak Island, where current-day Nikolsky Village is. He heard oral tradition about a homicide scene from 1764, and he went to that site and archaeologically excavated it. And some 206 years later, he found evidence of serial killings in the Aleutian Islands. Laughlin noted that Veniaminoff was inclined to believe that the number of Aleuts killed was in excess of 5,000. Glotov, Soloviev, and Pushkarev were apparently responsible for some 4,000 deaths. If accurate, that's an average of 1,303 homicides apiece. As a point of reference, the number of missing Alaskans today in 2023 is 1,322. So from 1745 through the 1760s, along the 1,000-mile Aleutian Island chain, there's evidence in the geographical place names of over 1,000 miles of serial killings, beginning with Attu Island in 1745, only 4 short years after Bering and Steller first sailed into the Aleutian Islands. Murder Point, Masker Bay, Masker Beach, Masker Valley East, Masker Valley West, and Krasny Point. Krasny is the Russian word for red. The ocean waters off this point were red from the blood of the Alaska Native people, and so they renamed it Krasny Point. And then on the other end of the Aleutian Islands, on Unimak Island, where they systematically went from village to village, killing everybody in the villages and then setting the villages on fire to make sure everybody was deceased, they renamed a village Pogromny Village. They didn't kill absolutely everybody. They did spare a few boys and a few girls to serve as slaves. The population in only 20 years was decimated to less than 2,000 people. Fast forwarding to the late 1890s with the gold rushes, Klondike, Chilkoot, Nome, and Fairbanks. These gold rushes resulted in lots of men and few women. And if you've read The Good Time Girls by Lael Morgan, she notes that this resulted in an increase in human trafficking, with a few and the human trafficking businesses in early Alaska history ended up bankrolling many businesses. The Anchorage Red Light District moved from Ship Creek, pushed south to 4th Avenue, and then to 9th Avenue, and then Spenard, and then east to Muldoon. These businesses were known as the trap line or the line, and quite often they recruited human trafficking victims from Washington, Oregon, and California. And this continued up through the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. During World War II, the United States government noted that human trafficking resulted in many soldiers being taken out of combat. When you have a lot of young soldiers in boot camps, consuming a lot of alcohol and bravado, the soldiers participated in human trafficking, and they got infections that took them out of battle. And this became a threat to national security, because if we don't have millions of soldiers in battle, a better chance of the United States losing the war, World War I. This resulted in the American Plan, which ended up, many people were victimized by trafficking, and this did little to change the behavior of the Johns. A quick overview of Alaska law enforcement from 1867 to the 1970s. It began with the United States military, the United States Navy, the United States Army, and then in 1884, the United States Marshals, the Anchorage Police Department in 1920, the Alaska State Troopers in 1941. This help wanted ad, you'll note that the Anchorage Police Department was looking for dependable men. If you were a woman back during these days, don't bother applying. In the 1970s, a woman went and applied to the Anchorage Police Department, and they told her flat out, we don't hire women to be police officers. She filed a lawsuit and became one of Anchorage Police Department's first female officers. She's honored in the Alaska Women's Hall of Fame. Fast forwarding to World War II, after World War II, an acronym NHI came about, standing for No Humans Involved. It's a really poor attitude towards human trafficking victims and a bad attitude towards some serial killing victims. No humans involved. Humans are reclassified as scumbags, and they basically do not deserve the attention from law enforcement. It's important to point out that all humans are human beings. No one has the right to declassify humans to NHI like Alaska's most prolific serial killer Bob Hansen did. A quote from United States Marshal in 1940. He was Marshal Alan Peterson, serving in the Shumagat Islands, where current-day Sandpoint is. Back then, there was a village called Unga. I know of several cases, particularly murders, where I'm sure I could run down the guilty party and bring him to justice if I had the funds with which to pursue the investigation, but I haven't. But if you read this article in the Alaska Sportsman, October 1940, he had Marshal Peterson had plenty of time to investigate other crimes, and his jail was mostly filled with Alaska Native people. The 1952 Federal Report of Human Trafficking in Alaska noted that there's real problems in Fairbanks and Anchorage, and exploiters are taking full advantage of Anchorage and Fairbanks. So Anchorage had over 30 years notice. Get your act together, clean up your act. This is unhealthy, it's unsafe. Do something about the human trafficking that is prolific in your town. A quote from an Alaska State Trooper in 1967. He was at that time stationed in Alaska. They could keep me busy full-time in the 1960s. I could have made a dozen arrests on my last visit, but there isn't time or money. I know of 5 deaths from questionable causes in the past year. None of these were investigated. So again, no time or money to investigate homicide investigations, yet time to investigate other crimes. 1967, the oil discovery in Alaska. The oil companies, 1968, the oil company says, who owns the land? We're not going to drill for oil. We're not going to build the pipeline until land ownership is resolved. 1971, United States President Richard M. Nixon signed the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. The land title was resolved. This resulted in a rush of men traveling to Alaska, thousands of men trying to get rich quick, which resulted in an increase in human trafficking and an increase in crime and an increase in communities and law enforcement in Alaska turning a blind eye to crime. We're going to transition to Bob Hansen's early life before he came to Alaska. Bob Hansen was born February 15th, 1939 in Iowa and raised in Pocahontas, Iowa. His mother was American, his father was Danish. He had a strict religious upbringing. His father owned a bakery street on Main Street in Pocahontas. Bob Hansen said that eating so many donuts or sweets resulted in him having extreme acne. He stuttered, he was shy, said he was bullied, made fun of us in school. For Bob Hansen, school was the monster. And he turned his anger against the school at age 21 when he set a school bus barn on fire and was sentenced to 20 years in prison, where he's diagnosed with manic depression and schizophrenia. It's interesting to note that Bob Hansen had 2 middle names, Christian and Bose. Christian means a follower of Christ, and Bose is Danish for bad, evil, wild, and angry. After the case was resolved, one of the Alaska State Troopers, Walt Gilmore, co-authored a book with Leland Hale. The book was titled Butcher Baker, A True Account of a Serial Murderer. And this book resulted in several films, including Frozen Ground with Nicolas Cage, The Butcher Baker, Mind of a Monster, and an animated film called Butcher Baker in Alaska. The second film on this slide, The Butcher Baker, Mind of a Monster, is available for free on Netflix. And in this film, they took the time to find some of the people that were involved in the case, such as Anchorage Police Detective Greg Baker, Anchorage Police Detective Maxine Farrell. And I encourage you to review all of these sources and to learn more about this case. The co-author of Butcher Baker, Leland Hale, said that there was a tolerance towards prostitution in Alaska that was not the same as it would be in some other places in the United States. So again, communities and law enforcement in Alaska turned a blind eye to human trafficking. In 1967, Bob Hansen moved to Alaska. He lived first in Mountain View and then moved to Muldoon. He was married, had 2 sons and a daughter. In Muldoon, he lived in a private one-family residence on a street called Old Harbor. He had a bakery at 9th and Ingra, and later on purchased a small airplane that he kept at Merrill Field. He was an avid hunter and got a thrill out of stealing. So this map shows where Bob Hansen's bakery was at 9th and Ingra. And from this location, he had quick and easy access to the downtown area, 4th Avenue and 5th Avenue, where human trafficking was prolific in the 1960s, 70s, and 1980s. You could drive down 4th Avenue back then on several corners, there would be clear evidence of human trafficking. Bob Hansen also had access to Merrill Field, where he kept his airplane, and to the Seward Highway, where he could drive down to the Seward area and look for additional victims. It's important to remember back in the 1970s, there weren't computers, there wasn't APSN, there wasn't NCIC, and so law enforcement had to rely upon the memory of state troopers or police officers. And Alaska State Trooper Walt Gilmore remembered that Bob Hansen has a record as long as the Aleutian Islands. Part of that record was a November 22nd, 1971 arrest in the Spenard area off the 3600 block of Lois Avenue for kidnapping and sexual assault of a housewife and a real estate agent. Unfortunately, Bob Hansen was quickly released on bail and back on the streets of Anchorage, where he could commit further crimes. On December 19th, 1971, an 18-year-old female who had substance abuse challenges was down in the downtown area of Anchorage in the 4th Avenue, 5th Avenue area. And she was in a parking lot. A vehicle pulled up to her. They had a verbal exchange. And the verbal exchange was basically a sex act for a certain amount of money. And she got into the vehicle driven by Bob Hansen and was kidnapped at gunpoint, taken all the way south to Cooper Landing. She was assaulted. She believed she was going to be killed, but somehow she was able to talk the man out of killing her. She was the daughter of an Alaska State Trooper and too terrified to report, too ashamed to report. Her parents brought her up in a good home, told her to stay away from drugs, told her to stay away from human trafficking. So she suffered a great deal of shame, so much shame that she was not willing to report it to the Alaska State Troopers or the Anchorage Police Department. But then tragically, just a few days later on Christmas Eve, 1971, the body of an 18-year-old female was found deceased in McHugh Creek. And the Alaska State Trooper daughter heard about this, and she recognized the pattern. She was convinced that the person responsible for the homicide of the 18-year-old female was Bob Hansen. This helped her overcome her fears and her embarrassment, and she did not want to see others killed, so she reached out to law enforcement and reported what happened to her. In the 1980s, the district attorney that was eventually assigned to the case was Frank Rothschild. And what he said is from the 1971 arrest, Bob Hansen learned. He learned to choose those victims carefully, that police believed nice girls. They believed the real estate agent, but they did not believe the 18-year-old woman involved in human trafficking. So Bob Hansen learned that police don't believe human trafficking victims, that traffickers lie and have no credibility. Anchorage Police Captain Ron Rice put a little bit more strongly. He said, we taught Bob Hansen to kill. When we didn't put him away for a long time, we not only taught him to kill, we taught him who to kill way back in 1972. We told him it's all right to kill human trafficking victims because nobody cares about human trafficking victims. This map shows the 7200 block of Old Harbor off of Muldoon, off of about 9th and Muldoon. Directly to the north is Creekside Park Elementary. Today, to the south is Walmart and Fred Meyer's. It's a quiet, dead-end, one-way residential street. In 1976, Bob Hansen was arrested for shoplifting a chainsaw at Fred Meyer's. This was probably the Fred Meyer's on New Seward and Northern Lights. For this, he was sentenced to 60 months in jail, where he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. He was required to get psychiatric care, but tragically, the Alaska court overruled the sentence, and Bob Hansen was out in 15 months back on the streets to commit more crimes. And again, in the 1960s through 1980s, there were strip joints all around Anchorage, 4th Avenue, Spenard, diamond businesses like the Wild Cherry, the Booby Trap, the Good Times, Goldies. Lots of money involved, organized crime involved, and again, communities that tolerated crime and law enforcement that turned a blind eye to human trafficking. In 1981, Bob Hansen filed a false report from his residence on Old Harbor, saying his residence was burglarized and that his taxidermy mounts were stolen, mountain goat mounts, bird mounts, and fish mounts. He valued these mounts at $13,000, and his insurance company wrote him out a check for $13,000, which he used to buy a new airplane, a Super Cub. One of the victims who survived in 1983 described the basement in Bob Hansen's house on Old Harbor. She said there's goat mounts, there's bird mounts, there's fish mounts. And so this was used as a basis for a crime charge of theft in the 2nd degree against Bob Hansen. On June 13th, 1983, a 17-year-old minor who was exploited in human trafficking was working Denali Street from 4th Avenue to 5th Avenue to 6th Avenue. And a vehicle drove up to her. The driver rolled down the window. The driver was Bob Hansen. They agreed to a sex act for $600. She got into the vehicle, was overpowered. He handcuffed her, took her to his residence on Old Harbor. So this map shows the route that Bob Hansen followed again and again, at least 17 times, from the 4th Avenue, 5th Avenue, 6th Avenue area to the Glen Highway to Muldoon, to his residence on Old Harbor, where he would assault the victims, and then back out to Muldoon to DeBar, where he would drive to his airplane that he kept at Merrill Field. But on June 13th, 1983, that 17-year-old girl, by now she was in the back of Bob Hansen's vehicle down at Merrill Field. She was naked and handcuffed. She realized if she didn't take action pretty quickly, her life was not going to be around much longer. So she saw a moment, an opportunity, and she bolted from the vehicle and flagged down a citizen who thankfully stopped for her. The citizen wanted to take her immediately to the Anchorage Police Department, but she said, no, take me to my hotel first. I think it was the Big Timber Hotel on 5th Avenue. She went there to her hotel and eventually reported the assault to the Anchorage Police Department. So the question was, what was the quality of the Anchorage Police Department investigation? And again, I worked for the APD from 1983 to 2003. I wish I could say the quality of the investigation was good, but it was not. To quote Anchorage Police Detective Maxine Farrell, it was a lousy job. The authors of the book, Butcher Baker, said that APD had a dinosaur attitude. They first corroborated the victim's statement. They listened to it. They went to Bob Hansen's house. They confirmed the description of this house, as she said. But unfortunately, they believed Bob Hansen. Bob Hansen had an alibi, a prominent member of the Anchorage insurance industry. And unfortunately, they believed that alibi too. And the detective assigned to the case, which was not Maxine Farrell and it was not Greg Baker, the detective determined that the 17-year-old could not be believed. He didn't even take any photographs of the crime scene of the residence at Merrill Field. There was evidence collected at the hospital. He did not even collect that evidence. The case at that time was suspended. I think the full title is something like suspended due to lack of investigative leads. So that could have been the end of the case, but an Anchorage police officer named Greg Baker felt that what happened was not right. He felt that the case could have been better investigated. He bundled up all the cases involving Bob Hansen and carried them over to the Alaska State Troopers. This was in violation of APD policy. He probably could have been disciplined, if not terminated, for taking his actions. But the case was eventually assigned to Alaska State Trooper Glenn Flothy, who did an excellent investigation. He enlisted the help of a FBI special agent who did a profile. And by now, bodies were being found in shallow graves in the Knik River area. Near the bodies was .223 caliber brass, which the Alaska State Troopers, and particularly Glenn Flothy, were anxious to connect back to the suspect. A quote from the book Butcher Baker from the Alaska State Trooper whose daughter was assaulted. You see, this girl is my daughter. And you know, me and her mom are pretty active in our church. I have talked to her about what she's doing. She knows we love her and she can always come home. Maybe this will help her find her way. At the same time, her mother and me are not proud of what she's done. We love her. So after Alaska State Trooper Glenn Flothy investigated the case, and he bundled up his report and took it down to the Anchorage District Attorney's Office, hoping that they would help him prosecute Bob Hansen. But tragically, the response of the Anchorage District Attorney's Office, this was back in 1983, was we don't have time, we don't have any district attorneys to help you. What's more important than an active serial killer in Alaska? A quote from Anchorage Police Captain Ron Rice. So what else is new? It's a little club down there at the district attorney's office. The DA is more interested in making deals with Hansen's attorney. The Alaska State Troopers could have given up. They could have said, well, we did all we could. We took the case to the district attorney's office, and they turned us down. So blame it on the DA's office. We did all we could. But fortunately, the motto of the Alaska State Troopers is never, 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 never give up. And so they continued their investigation. They began tailing Bob Hansen everywhere he went, to his business, his house, his plane at Merrill Field. If he launched his plane from Merrill Field, they launched another undercover Alaska State Trooper plane and followed him to Knik River or Prince William Sound. There's a real risk in tailing a suspect, and that's that at any point in time, he may realize he's being tailed and he may start destroying evidence. The Alaska State Troopers did another wise thing. They went district attorney shopping. Up in Fairbanks, they contacted District Attorney Pat Dugan. He agreed to travel down to Anchorage. They took him to the Alaska State Trooper headquarters over at Tudor and Boniface, sat him down in an old-fashioned typewriter. All Friday night, DA Pat Dugan and State Trooper Glenn Flothy sat down and started typing an affidavit. An affidavit is a very powerful investigative tool. It's a document that lines out all the facts. It forces law enforcement officers to get their ducks in a row. All Saturday, District Attorney Pat Dugan and Glenn Flothy worked on the affidavit until 2 in.the morning. Bright and early Sunday morning, they got back up and got back to work on the affidavit. And by Sunday evening, Pat Dugan had to fly back up to Fairbanks. They eventually took the affidavit before Judge Victor Carlson. Judge Victor Carlson very carefully read the affidavit, which by now was many, many pages long, outlining all the facts. And at the end after reading this affidavit by DA Pat Dugan and State Trooper Glenn Flothy, Judge Victor Carlson agreed that there was probable cause to believe that Bob Hansen was responsible for crimes in Alaska. Judge Carlson ordered the Alaska State Troopers to search his residence on Muldoon, his business, his vehicles, his planes, his boats, and his alibi's home, as well as his person. The Alaska State Troopers went to that residence at the 7200 block of Old Harbor and searched it for many, many hours. And it's not that big of a residence, but they ended up not finding anything. They searched for 10 hours and they did not find the evidence they were expecting to find. No rifles, no jewelry. Their frustration level was growing. At that point in time, they could have concluded their search and they could have said, well, we did all we could. Maybe he realized he was being followed and he destroyed all the evidence. But again, fortunately, the motto of the Alaska State Trooper is never, 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 never give up. And behind his board, the headboard of his bed, they eventually found an aeronautical map. And on the map, there was 24 asterisk marks, and it was an aviation map. His wife said he read it at nighttime. Eventually, Bob Hansen would admit to 17 of the marks were graves of victims that he had killed. These victims were involved in human trafficking. There were 7 additional marks of people that weren't involved in human trafficking that Bob Hansen did not admit to. So in Bob Hansen's mind, it's okay to kill human traffic victims because they're not human beings. It's important to point out that human trafficking victims are human beings, and Bob Hansen's way of thinking landed him in jail. When the Alaska State Troopers peeled back the insulation in the roof of Bob Hansen's house on Old Harbor, they found a Mini 14 rifle, a Thompson Contender pistol with interchangeable barrels, including a .223 caliber, items from the victims, a second map, as well as clothing, necklaces, bracelets, and watches. His weapons of choice was the Ruger Mini 14. It's a high caliber rifle, short, lightweight. And in Bob Hansen's words, I like the small, high caliber velocity rifles. If you ever go to Sitka, I encourage you to call up to the Alaska State Trooper Academy and see if you can arrange a tour of their academy. Bob Hansen's airplane of choice was a Super Cub. The Super Cub, the front tires of it, you notice, has very big tires. Those big tires you can land on beaches such as ocean beaches, river beaches, or lake beaches. This map shows the flight pattern that Bob Hansen followed at least 17 times from the Merrifield Airport up to Knik River. On February 24th, 1984, Bob Hansen was charged with 4 of the 17 homicides, and he was convicted, and Judge Ralph Moody sentenced Bob Hansen to 461 years plus life in jail. In 2014, Bob Hansen died in prison, and he is a suspect in many more homicides. Several of his victims involved victims of human trafficking. The district attorney who was assigned to the case, Frank Rothschild, said the system had failed the public, which allowed Bob Hansen to prey on women for a long, long time. I'm going to transition quickly to the status today of serial killers, human trafficking, and MMIP. So the question is, after Bob Hansen was arrested and put in prison in 1983, did serial killings in Alaska stop? And tragically, the answer is no. There's been at least 6 recent serial killers with over 60 victims. That's an average of 1 serial killing in Alaska per year over the past 60 years or so. From Bob Hansen, there was Thomas Richard Bunday. In 2003, the bodies of 2 human trafficking victims were found in the mudflats south of Anchorage. Those homicides are still unsolved. 2007, Joshua Way. 2012, Israel Keys. 2016, James Dale Ritchie. 2019, Jessica Spade. Jessica Spade is an outlier in the sense that she did not have to use weapons or tobacco or alcohol. She went straight to the drugs. She was a nurse practitioner that had an office in Eagle River from 2014 to 2019 with 450 patients. She dispensed between 4 million and 18 million pills, mostly pain pills. She is responsible for at least 5 deaths and maybe as many as 20. To quote Assistant U.S. Attorney Ryan D. Tansey, Jessica Spade was a serial killer with a poisonous pen. On the other side of the country, down in Florida, the Radford, Florida Gulf Coast University, they're the largest non-governmental serial killer database in the world. They have over 5,753 subjects in their database. A quote from Dr. Louis Schleichinger from the John Jay College of Criminal Justice: there's 10 ominous signs of someone who may be or may become a serial killer, including victim of childhood abuse, inappropriate maternal sexual conduct, pathological lying and manipulation, sadistic fantasy with compulsion to act, animal cruelty, especially to cats, the need to control or dominate others, repeated fire setting, voyeurism fetishes, sex-motivated crimes, unprovoked attacks on females, and evidence of ritualistic or signature behavior. Research done by Melody Schreiber, she wanted to see if there's connections between youth homelessness and human trafficking. She surveyed 10 cities in the United States. Out of these 10 cities, she found Anchorage that had the highest rates, with 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 5 boys at Covenant House, Alaska, reporting being victims of sex trafficking. Melody said that Alaska human trafficking is a serious but mostly invisible concern, a crime, and it's below the radar. Alaska Native and American Indian people suffer homicide rates 3.2 times non-natives. The Missing Persons Clearinghouse has over 1,325 people with an overrepresentation of American Indian and Alaska Natives. The Alaska State Trooper Cold Case Homicide says that between 1961 and 2001, there's 68 cold case homicides. The Anchorage Crime Stoppers has 40 unsolved homicides in Anchorage from 1965 to 2003, with some of those being human trafficking and victims. I encourage you to go to the site, and it has photographs of the victims while they're alive, the names, as well as rewards being offered, and the opportunity to report anonymously. I'm going to transition now to available services for Alaska survivors in crime, including the Alaska Office of Victims' Rights, which includes free legal service to advance and protect those victims' rights in court. The Alaska Native Justice Center, with culturally based advocacy, prevention, and intervention services to restore dignity, respect, and humanity of all Alaska Native people. The Alaska Institute for Justice, dedicated to protecting the human rights of all Alaskans. Covenant House, to serve suffering children on the street and to protect and safeguard all children. Stand Together Against Rape has been responding to the needs of survivors of sexual assault since 1978. Abused Women in Crisis, offering safe shelter, intervention, and prevention to domestic violence victims. Unalaska Against Sexual Assault and Family Violence, to empower people and create a culture of nonviolence and respect. And then Vine. I've used Vine recently, and it does work well. It worked well for me to notify me when a defendant was being released from jail. In June 2023, Attorney General Merrick Garland announced that he's appointing 3 Indian County Assistant United States Attorneys and 1 MMIP coordinator to keep our communities safe and pursue justice for American Indian and Alaska Native families. I'm going to jump quickly to 5 practical crime prevention tips. First one is to file a flight plan, let people know where you're going, who you're going with, what route you'll be, what route you're returning, when you're expected to return. There's safety in numbers. 2 is an important number. Always take a safety buddy with you. Tip number 2, there's public information that's available. One that I use a lot is Alaska Court View. You don't need a username and password. It's available to the public. You can run criminal histories, civil histories, and but 2 little caveats. It's important to confirm identification. There's a lot of people in Alaska with the first name and even similar dates of birth. And the second caveat is everyone's presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Tip number 3 is a surveillance camera. I've been informally tracking crimes in Alaska that have been caught on video or audio. 2012, an Anchorage serial killer was caught on video. 2014, the homicides of 2 Alaska State Troopers caught on audio. 2016, a serial killer. 2018, a father and a son that went to a den where a sow and her cubs were hibernating, and their killing of the sow and cub was caught on video. 2018, 2 homicides. 2019, an Anchorage porch arson, where a family had a camera on their doorbell, and a man, their video captured a man walking up to the porch with a gas can, pouring gas on their porch and setting on fire. That porch arson still unsolved. 2021, Eagle River homicide. 2022, a Kenai homicide. Metlakatla, a double homicide. I think that one was captured by an elementary school surveillance video camera. And 2023, a homicide. So more and more, there's people have cameras on their doors, on the back of their house, on their garages. And these video cameras are capturing people committing crimes, resulting in better prosecution, and in my opinion, resulting in the prevention of crimes. Crooks aren't stupid. I've worked with crooks over the past 40 years. They're intelligent people. They look around, they see that there's video cameras, and when they do, they'll move on. So if you don't have one, they're inexpensive. You can get one for less than $100. They're easy to install. The quality of audio is incredible. Tip number 4, pay attention to what we read, listen to, and watch. If we ingest media which normalizes violence, particularly violence against women, against Indigenous people, against human trafficking victims, it becomes normalized. Maybe it's time we change what we view, what we read, what we listen to, and what we normalize. Time to uplift, and honor victims of crime. My last tip is to harden the target. For at least 10,000 years, Alaska Native people have been raising youth to fight and battle and win. With physical strength training, physical agility training, training to work in teams, to engage in combat fighting and win, whether these attacks are against humans or animals, to be vigilant of our surroundings and domain, because we never know when an animal or human's going to attack us. It's important to note who took down Alaska's most prolific serial killer. who was a 17-year-old human trafficking survivor. In conclusion, in the olden days, we blamed the victim, saying that could never happen to me or anybody I know. But today, I realize if my life had taken different paths, I could have easily ended up being more of a victim of crime than I have been. It's time to help each other heal, to deal with underlying issues, to provide needed services, to provide support and encouragement so that victims of crime can get back in the battle. In conclusion, information is power. I hope this presentation has increased your awareness, your compassion, and your understanding. With more information, we can improve our communities and make it safer for us and for future generations. In my presentation, I've kind of beat up upon my alma mater, the Anchorage Police Department, where I served for 20 years. It's important to note that that was 40 years ago, and there's been major improvements to the Anchorage Police Department, in my opinion, resulting in better investigations and more compassion. And I think I can say the same for the Anchorage District Attorney's Office. I think today things are much better than they were 40 years ago. I mentioned Anchorage Police Officer and then Anchorage Police Detective Greg Baker, who's since retired. His son has been hired by the Anchorage Police Department, as well as granddaughter. So there's 3 generations of Bakers that will do everything they can to ensure that that serial killers in Alaska are investigated better than they were in the past. Please take the pre-post survey. Again, if you can't find that link, let me know and I will add it back into the chat. But if you scroll up, it should be visible. And again, there's a contest. There's 2 veiled references in this certificate. So far, nobody's been able to figure it out. Please continue your research, and information is power. I have a list of references here. In my opinion, the best one is the book Butcher Baker by Walt Gilmore and Leland Hale. But there are other references that you can have access to. I'd like to conclude by saying Gagasakun, thank you for your attention. If you have any questions or comments, I'm going to shut off the recording in just a few moments so that you can feel free to ask. Today is a National Day of Remembrance for murder victims. I'd like to have a moment of silence for survivors of victims, families, friends, colleagues. May their losses not be in vain.
This message is brought to you by the Aleutian Pribilof Islands Association.